planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, but being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, the propagandize, fake chocolate points, flat out lies. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to view the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. I mean, you wonder I got this big grin laugh at the beginning of these live lines. It gives me an opportunity to talk about the great music by Bob Pace that he provides for the podcast. And I also like to acknowledge the other people that participate and add stuff to this. You see the intro by Ron Placone, the theme song that he provided, which you can get one of your own, by the way. If you just go to ronplacone.com, he'll give you a theme song for just becoming a patron for, I don't know, $1 a month or something like that. Do that. It's a great thing to have a theme song. You know, Matt Woods has music on the show. We start with him a lot of times, and also Desharm Jones. Their great music will start us off. And the voice that you hear a lot of times on Podcast by George is John Schaefer. But this is a big one for me, another special exclusive edition of Podcast by George, another live line with our friend, our buddy, our pal, Matthew Hoh. And for folks that may not know, Matthew Hoh is a member of the advisory boards of Exposed Facts, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War. On 2009, he kind of leapt to the national consciousness. He resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest of the escalation of the Afghan war by the Obama administration. Yeah, not because of Donald Trump or anything like that, because of the Obama administration. He previously had been in Iraq with a State Department team and with the U.S. Marines. He is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. And, you know, when Matt comes on, we're always talking about heavy things, talking about the world of war. So I'm going to start us off here if I can. If I get lucky here with a little bit of a funny this morning that I saw that I really like. This is from the Twitter feed of Jim Earl. He's one of the writers for the Jimmy Dore Show. A lot of those sketches that you see on there are written by Jim. And he's just a funny guy. But he says, my thanks to any crypto libertarian leftists out there for clearing up any doubt that using lethal force with an instrument of mass death was totally proportionate self-defense against a guy with a skateboard and a mentally ill yelling guy throwing a plastic bag full of socks. I mean, truth is more compelling than fiction. And sometimes, unfortunately, truth is it can be funnier than fiction, although that's not a very funny circumstance. But that's Jim Earl. I mean, that guy's got a way of making a point. Let's go ahead and bring our guest in, Matthew Hoh. Matt, I thought about you when I saw that tweet from Jim Earl, because as a company commander there in Iraq with the Marines, you know a little something about walking down a street with a military weapon in your hand. Sometimes shit happens. And if you don't want it to happen, probably ought not be doing that. That's kind of the way the Rittenhouse case struck me overall, kind of the broad picture of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I really agree with that. The spirit and theme and message of that tweet, this young man, and I have sympathy for him. I mean, he's a 17-year-old kid. People put these thoughts in his head. I'm sure he grows up in a household that these types of messages are on the TV and the radio and the internet all the time. I mean, hey, his mom drove him with his rifle to this protest out of state. I get more concerned with the people who are manipulating people like this, particularly young people who make mistakes. They're young, right? I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. That's why, those of us who are older are supposed to impart some degree of wisdom and some degree of compassion and some degree of restraint. But yeah, I mean, you put yourself in a situation like that, the outcomes can get out of hand very quickly. And this idea that this self-defense narrative that you have the right to shoot anyone that you feel is threatening you, even antecedents be damned, whatever occurred before the event. I mean, that's a very dangerous path we're on. And we see with the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia, where the defense argued that as well, that, I shot, the one man on trial, I shot Ahmaud Arbery because he was going to take my weapon from me. Well, I mean, you're the one who pointed the weapon at him. Even if it was true, he was trying to get the weapon. Anyone would do that if someone was, so you see this and gets to the point where, George, if I'm sitting in a Starbucks and a guy, and now because we got a big Supreme Court case coming up on guns, in the next, in next month or so, I believe, actually. And, it gets to the point where if I'm sitting in a coffee shop or something like that, and I'm carrying a weapon, and someone walks in who does carry a weapon, do I have the right to shoot that person automatically because I'm afraid?
Yes.
Right? I mean, like, where does the line end for this self-defense narrative, this self-defense explanation or excuse or whatever? And it is, we're in this small arms race, which is mirrored in the large arms race, all the way up to nuclear weapons. We just saw that Department of Defense says China's building 1,000 new nuclear weapons. Well, why are they doing that? Well, because we keep threatening them, because we built nuclear weapons that made their current nuclear weapons obsolete, because we got out of the 2002 ABM treaty. And in 2002, people said, if you get out of the ABM treaty, George W. Bush, this is going to spark an arms race. And 20 years later, you see the fruition of that, because the Russians and the Chinese have all these new missiles and technologies and weapons. Why do they have those? Because they felt threatened, And so when you threaten people, and we have to remember we're dealing with other people. So you can't control what other people do. And if you threaten them, where does that's the whole thing. You bring a rifle to a protest. And thank God we didn't have more of these events. It's the biggest mass demonstrations in the history of America in the summer of 2020. Thank God we didn't have more events like the Rittenhouse killings, because it really could have been there.
Well, when you talk about Rittenhouse and these mass demonstrations that you talk about, it reminds me of our last podcast. There's always a percentage, I don't know what it is, but there's going to be a percentage of lunatics in that crowd, folks. And if you're carrying a weapon and if they got one, bad things can happen. It also reminds me of our last podcast and that situation that you described with the smoke grenade skipping across the pavement, striking that guy in the head. If everybody's walking around with these types of weapons, and you know this from being in the military, in the war theater, I mean, things are going to happen. Not planned, not Hollywood, not pretty, but deadly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I was in the Pentagon during the invasion of the Iraq War, I worked for the Secretary of Navy, and I had the duty of working with all the families of Marines that were killed during the invasion of Iraq. And what I found, because I had to know this, I had to read about how they died, why they were killed, was that half of the Marines that were killed in the invasion of Iraq in spring of 2003, roughly about 100 or so, half of them were killed by friendly fire or accident, right? I mean, that's not what people think happens. That's not what people expect happens in an invasion, in a war. No, but half of the young men and women who were killed over there died either by bullets or shells from other Marines or by accidents, right? I mean, that certainly doesn't go with the glory of war, does it? It really doesn't go with this idea that we are masters of war, that our technology has risen to the point where we can dominate everything. I mean, that's certainly what Donald Rumsfeld and company were saying in 2003 about our mastery of war, the whole shock and awe, and then others like Karl Rove saying how we dictate history. You just live it, but we're the ones who create history. I mean, these are the thoughts of these people, and the idea of them having some type of psychopathy, as we discussed last time, it really meets those. And I think we don't like to talk about that because we might feel it's rude or it's unbecoming or it's a low bar attack on someone. But the reality is that many of these people do exhibit the traits of psychopaths. And a lot of them are, as equal as they are psychopaths, they have this mixture of arrogance and ignorance where they think they can control things like violence for their own outcomes.
The other thing, I'm not like everybody, obviously, and I'm getting a little depressed about the way things have regression, how we have regressed in this society. That Rittenhouse trial and what everybody was saying, it reminded me of the old newspaper accounts of the shootout at the OK Corral between Wyatt Earp and Ike Clanton and those guys, and who exactly was at fault. And back then they were talking about who had guns and who didn't, who felt threatened and who didn't, who pointed a weapon first, who fired first. And that's how things were decided upon and litigated and described in the press of the day. Well, my God, that's what this Rittenhouse thing was really all about. I mean, we're really talking about who pointed a gun first, and instead of talking about the circumstances that have regressed to the point to where this is considered to be by a lot of people a normal part of American society. And I didn't think we were going to talk about Rittenhouse this much, but I did want to say this, and it's something that I've been wanting to talk to you about because I know you did some appearances with her and you were kind of undecided about her candidacy as president, but Tulsi Gabbard is really kind of shocking and dismaying a lot of people on the progressive left with her viewpoints.
Yes.
Yeah, her perspective on Rittenhouse was kind of odd. I've got I want to, because I was a fan of hers. I supported her candidacy when she was saying and appeared to be doing the right things. But I told people, I said, the only pass that I can give Tulsi Gabbard, perhaps, on this thing, I don't know if it even passes the test, but it looks to me like she's kind of trying to bring in the libertarian, the right-wing Fox network viewers on some secondary societal view things. And Rittenhouse would be an example. Now, I'm not condoning this approach, but trying to embrace those folks to kind of get them on board, perhaps, so that she can build a coalition, maybe even a voting bloc that can do something about not secondary issues, but primary issues like war and climate, as an example. But I don't know, Matt. Are you seeing? I'm stretching a little too far there, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're, and I feel the same, trying to hold on to something that's not there any longer, right? Because she was, and I worked with her several years ago. I worked with her and the late Walter Jones in Congress on, it was an act. It was an act of Congress to make waging undeclared war an impeachable offense. So that if the president goes and invades a country or attacks a country or does whatever, and plenty of examples of that, Democrat and Republican, without the approval of Congress, the support of Congress, that's an impeachable offense. I mean, that was the type of thing that she was doing, and she was very good on the wars. She was very good on Medicare for all. I mean, a bunch of progressive issues. And then over these last, year or so, really taking a U-turn on a lot of progressive things. I mean, that back before she left Congress last year, she introduced some pretty anti-abortion type, anti-choice type legislation that shocked a lot of people. She has been kind of doubling down on what can be rightly taken on Islamophobic comments. And then this with the Rittenhouse, and then you hear a lot of this stuff on Twitter or whatever, saying, she's auditioning for a job at Fox, but she's appealing to this, and it's kind of like the tweet you posted at the beginning of this segment, right? Where there have been leftists, so-called progressives, who have been defending Rittenhouse, and so it's this weird, embrace of violence by leftists or by progressives, signified by Tulsi Gabbard, I guess, that really goes against, in my opinion, the underlying foundations of what progressivism is, of what being of the left is. I mean, we, as I understand it, are a movement that are not pacifist, but not interventionist, and certainly not a movement that sees the use of rifles. I mean, and certainly there's plenty of examples of the left's history, right, where violence was utilized. But in terms of the American left, the left that I think that comes out of, say, Eugene Debs, right? This, that nonviolence and compassion for others. And, certainly you can try and understand someone like Rittenhouse, and you can have sympathy. The girlfriend of one of Rittenhouse's victims has expressed sympathy for the young man. And I think it's right to do so, to understand that, look, I took part in those wars. I'm as guilty as doing things as Rittenhouse did, right? But I have received the forgiveness of others, and I'm allowed to move forward with my life. And I think that's and missing, to your point, George, the larger discussion about this. The role of violence in our society, the role of violence-based solutions. How come nearly all of our discussions are rooted in some form of violence, and that takes place in our culture, in our entertainment, and our politics. I mean, you look at the way our politicians talk, you look at what our media portrays, what our news media presents, the use of force or violence in order to achieve objectives or goals. We're not having those discussions, but we're talking, specifically about what a 17-year-old boy did, egregious and tragic and horrible. But we're losing sight of the forest for the trees.
Well, that segues very nicely into this comment. I like to get the comments from the viewers on here, because I want to encourage everybody not only to watch, but to participate. And this Rittenhouse thing is a hot button, so I don't want to spend the whole show talking about this, but I want to bring this up because this gets to exactly what you're talking about. This is from a viewer, Herschel Sanders. And this goes to the wording that you used, calling it a protest. He says, laugh out loud, burning, looting, and violence is not a protest. Well, he might be overstating that, but again, we're losing the big picture here. This is a 17-year-old kid with a weapon that Matt knows all too well that can blow you apart in an instant. And it's on the streets of a city that has a police force, in a state that has a National Guard, in a country that has a U.S. Army. We can destroy this world several times over. The police on our streets have the same weapons Matt carried. I mean, we have no shortage of weaponry for people to use them. We don't need 17-year-old boys walking down the streets of a protest that may turn violent, who knows, with an assault rifle. That's the forest that you're talking about.
Yeah, and Herschel knows this too, and I appreciate him writing in. Herschel was one of my Marines in Iraq, so thanks, brother, for chiming in. And I took part in a large number, in at least a half dozen, maybe 10 protests. Over the summer here in North Carolina last year. And the description of the protests, we'd have 1,000 people, 2,000 people, 5,000 people, and there'd be 3 or 4 knuckleheads knocking over trash cans, lighting a trash can on fire, spraying graffiti on a wall. And that gets portrayed as violence. And the media shows that trash can or those porta johns or whatever knocked over. I mean, what occurred at most of these protests, and it's clear, and studies have been done about this, 99% of the protests were peaceful. I mean, that's not debatable, and the lot of the violence, the rioting, the looting that occurred in the vast majority of these protests were no different than what occurred at the NC State football game the other night, right? I mean, I saw worse stuff done after college football games. So, but that's not saying that there wasn't violence and looting that occurred, right? There was particularly in some of the earlier protests immediately after George Floyd's killing, there was looting. There was a Target was burned down, and one place a police station was burned down. But I think we lose fact here. I mean, are you really saying that the destruction of property merits vigilante justice on the streets? I mean, first of all, for all I know about Kenosha, and somebody could tell me I'm wrong, the only thing that occurred there that meets the standard of looting and rioting and was a burning dumpster. So some jackass lit a dumpster on fire. That means that we should have vigilantes with AR-15s on the streets shooting people who they determine, so there is this disconnect, but it also goes to show, I've heard this from so many people, description of the protests that are completely misaligned, with what I witnessed in these protests, rioting, looting. No, a couple of windows got broken, but you're gonna declare that you're gonna say that a couple of windows broken means that the whole argument over 1,000 police killings every year is not worthwhile, is not justified, is not morally correct. I mean, so if you are siding with broken windows and sprayed on graffiti, right, and burning trash cans, and a couple of incidents, in reality, I mean, it's so few, the actual number of, I mean, you can cherry pick it, but again, remember, this was the largest, I mean, tens of millions of people on the streets. And, so of course you're going to find examples, but when you look at the mass of the protests, they were by and large incredibly peaceful and nonviolent. And this was in response to state violence. And this is what, and I know a lot of the people who say things like Herschel said come from a libertarian spectrum. And, you have to say, where are your principles at? These are people who are exercising their First Amendment principles to protest against state violence. That's what we're talking about here. And this idea that you're going to have a vigilante system. And we're seeing this. We see this with the vigilante system that Texas put into place, where, if a person has an abortion, if a person conducts an abortion, if a person drives somebody to an abortion clinic, a vigilante can sue them and collect a $10,000 reward. I mean, is that where we're heading here, where we have no rule of law, no order, no institutional? I mean, and there is a very real difference between having law and order, but having institutional control, having a working democracy, if you will, and having this level of state violence where we see 1,000 police killings a year that is uncomparable to any other developed or wealthy nation in the world. I mean, you have to compare the United States to the poorest, most disparate, broken nations in the world to see that level of police violence. You have to compare it to nations like Sudan to see the level of police violence that we have. I mean, so, that is why people were on the streets. And the fact that a guy like Rittenhouse shows up, with a rifle to these events, inserts himself in it, and then the violence occurs out of that, and 2 people are dead and 1 is maimed for life, as well as the tragedy of what's going to happen to this young man. I mean, what's his life going to be like after all of this? And that's why I say I have sympathy for him, just as I do for his victims.
Yeah, and the armed vigilantes have to be careful what they wish for. Again, referencing the OK Corral of people. I know a lot of my viewers have watched Tombstone, and actually a lot of that movie is factual. It's based on the news and the recording of the news articles of the day. And those cowboys, those were armed vigilantes, basically. The Clantons and those guys that were down at the OK Corral. And if you'll recall, Wyatt Earp's brother, who was the town marshal or whatever, wanted to go down there and disarm them. They were carrying guns in violation of the town ordinance. And Wyatt's like, oh, God, no. Yeah, you don't want to do that. And he said, well, they're breaking the law, Wyatt. So law enforcement then went after the armed vigilantes. They went down to the OK Corral, and my God, what ensued? I mean, here we are talking about it today, but I think honest to God, I read these accounts and I hear Tulsi Gabbard talk, like I mentioned earlier, and I expect people to start saying, I'll be your huckleberry, or you're a daisy if you do. Those are lines, that's actual nomenclature of the day that they put in that movie. My God, that's kind of what we're coming to. Well, I'm going to leave Rittenhouse there because we could go on and talk about that all day. It is a hot button, obviously. I wanted to talk about this kind of part 2 here, this outstanding article, Matt, that you just wrote in Counterpunch. And I'm going to bring that up on screen here and talk about it, because it's something that a lot of people aren't aware of, but they ought to be. And folks, I got to tell you this. These are things that you could and you should know, but you won't know if you don't patronize things like Counterpunch and Matthew Hoh, and maybe even in a little way podcast by George. They're not telling you these things that I'm about to bring up on screen, even after Afghanistan was the disaster that it was and proven to be wrong, and Matthew Hoh proven to be right. These are the people that now when the proof is present, we need to start looking for truth. And that's what's in this article. Let me bring this up. All right. So can you see that, Matt?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Now this is off your website, but this is the article. And by the way, I encourage everybody to go to MatthewHoh.com. Nearly 3/4 of the world's dictators receive U.S. weapons and military assistance. Folks, did you know that? 3/4 of the world's dictators receive U.S. weapons and military assistance. I mean, you'll hear this all the time about how we're for democracy and we're opposed to these strongmen around the world and we're in opposition of fascist dictators. Well, we're outfitting these guys. It reads the U.S. supports nearly 75% of the world's dictators, autocracies, monarchies, military regimes, etc., with weapons, military training, and money. Man, that money's important too. Don't forget about that. Please remember this the next time someone tells you the U.S. should do X or Y because such and such a nation is bad. Comparing Freedom House's list of not free nations to fiscal year 2020 U.S. overseas weapons sales, military training, and financial assistance, Matt says we find that of the 57 nations considered undemocratic, 42 receive weapons, training, and or money for their military and security services. This means 74% of the non-democratic nations of the world are supported militarily by the U.S. Interestingly, the remaining 15 nations are nearly all sanctioned. The world's countries can be divided into two parts. Those who receive weapons from the U.S. and those sanctioned. It seems like it's a pretty simple arrangement. Okay, Matt, the one thing that I wanted to bring up before you talked about this a little bit is you mentioned those nations that are undemocratic. Well, the way that they're staying undemocratic, the way that they're staying in power is with that military might that we're providing them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, some of the worst nations in the world in terms of the excesses of torture, violence, suppression, oppression, genocide, if you will, in some cases, are militarily supported by the United States. And that list is only what Freedom House says as not free. So nations that Freedom House says are partly free, but are still massive human rights violators, like Colombia, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Ukraine, those nations also receive weapons from the United States or military assistance or just cash directly to fund their militaries and their security services. And this is, you can't, I think, have a greater or more hypocrite. And one of the things, George, is, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and Veterans for Peace for a long time has been saying the wars overseas mirror the wars at home, or you can reverse that, whichever way you want to say it. And it's true. When you have a country where we supply 3/4 of the world's dictators with weapons, and we have the world's largest prison population, we have less than 5% of the world's population, and we have about 25% of the world's prisoners. How does that make us a beacon of freedom or a beacon of liberty or a beacon of democracy?
Yeah, and 70% of them are black and brown. I don't ever overlook or forget that. That's
right. One in three black men have a felony conviction or have a chance of having a felony conviction at 1 in 3. What's it for? What I think about it all the time. My neighbors across the street, their boys. Compare those boys to my white nephews. What are the odds for those young men as compared to the young white men in my family,
or the old white guys that were responsible for January 6th? That's the one thing about that. I'm kind of that's getting a little old seeing that every night on television, but that's the big part of it. Those guys aren't going to go to prison.
Exactly. And very few felony convictions. Herschel brought up the protest. You have people attacking police officers with bear spray. I don't think you have anything like that in the George Floyd protests where you can show that level of violence directed against police forces. Yeah, people throwing tear gas canisters back, or maybe some guy throwing a rock, but an organized assault on police forces captured on camera like that, and people are facing misdemeanor charges. Meanwhile, for the George Floyd protests, again, 99% of those protests peaceful. And look that up. If you don't believe me, look it up and ask people who took part in it, and you will find that that's the case. 14,000 arrests from those protests from summer of 2020. And many of those people are facing felony charges. I know people who have involved in environmental protests who have received felony convictions for property damage, right? But you have people who attacked the Congress, attacked police officers with weapons that they brought, and in an attempt to stop the counting of the vote, the count, the endorsement of the presidential election. I mean, people say that wasn't what it is. Oh, come on. I mean, what we deal with in this country, George, with the amount of, I don't want to say it wasn't this way before, because it was, because I'm old enough to remember Iran-Contra and listening to that on the radio, those hearings. And I mean, Reagan was totally a guy. I mean, talk about someone who would piss on your leg and tell you it's raining. Yeah. I mean, but we deal with that all the time. Oh, it wasn't about the vote counting. It wasn't about the presidential election. It was about, a lot of it's kind of like we have so much of that in this country, right? Example, the whole issue of the Civil War. People still carry on about states' rights. I mean, people carry on about, it was about tariffs. Come on, give me a break. I mean, you look at every document of secession from the South, and every one of those documents mentions slavery as the reason why they're seceding. But we have this ability in this country. We're so split, and we're so easily massaged, and we're so loyal to the authorities and the sources of media that we follow, that we are easily led into giving up all critical thought, all examination, all looking into this, and I read people who are the opposite of me on this. I read Glenn Greenwald is not on the same page as I am when it comes to the January 6th events. And I read Greenwald every week, and I disagree with him almost all the time. But, you have to do those things because maybe there was something I'm missing with January 6th. Maybe there was something about it. Maybe there was, or maybe there's elements to it. You had a great conversation the other day with Gerald Posner about the JFK assassination. I really encourage people to go back and listen to that. And Laura Bellin was on that. It was really fantastic. One of the things that Posner brings up about, he believes that the CIA and the National Archives and the White House are hiding things in the documents that they refuse to release about the JFK assassination. It's not that Oswald was a patsy or some sinister conspiracy, but for the fact all these other things that would embarrass. So do I believe that there may have been with January 6th, that there may have been FBI agents in the crowd, agents provocateur? Of course I do. Absolutely. But that's minor. And those are details to the story, and those are things that should be pursued. However, when you look, again, we lose the forest for the trees here. You had the president of the United States direct people to go to Congress and take care of the elections, to paraphrase him. And they did, and the fact that you have misdemeanor charges coming out of that, as opposed to what occurred with the protests, over 1,000 police killings a year. It really shows that we have an imbalance.
Well, I always like to back things up just a step or two, and maybe even a larger force to this. I'll never forget. I was, I think, working on Podcast by George, doing some, my minor research online or whatever. On January 6th, up pops this Status Quo, and I know you're well familiar with those folks. They're out there on the barricade line with a cell phone, basically, having this video on live, and I'm watching this on Status Quo, and I'm looking at this going, what in the hell? What's going on? Look at the size of that crowd. Yeah. And then I'm looking at law enforcement, and it's these dudes and some women too, and like bike helmets and stuff. And who are these people? What are they? Why are they trying to hold back this huge crowd of this angry mob? I mean, who started, what the hell? I'm looking at this. And the other thing about it was, why am I watching this live on Status Quo? I run in and turn on my national network news, and there are millions and bajillions of Bill Gates dollars that they're running these networks with. And I'm looking at it, and they don't have any coverage at all. I run back to my computer. I'm looking at this going, holy cow. I mean, and it did kind of look like a setup. It looked like these law enforcement officials either were incapable or unwilling of holding this crowd back outside the gate, and how they ever came to be there like that. I'm looking at that. And then why no one was covering. And my God, is this how far we have regressed? Our network television news, this literally was just feet or yards from where they were at inside the chamber, covering that crap that was going. And I mean, I'll never forget that as long as I live. I bring that up. It didn't seem to have any effect on people, though.
And you have very real questions from that day. Why was the police force so small?
Yeah.
When in other circumstances, there are multiple levels of security. And why was this force so small that day, in spite of everything they knew? And is anyone going to be held accountable for it? Why was the National Guard not sent when it was? I mean, requesting. You had our political leaders, say what you will of them, but they are our political leaders, begging for help, calling the chairman and Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying we need help. There's a delay of hours that takes place here. Why? And that's my it gets back to this issue of truth. And will the Democrats actually do something about this, hold people accountable, or will they just fundraise off of it? And this gets back to I know people maybe tuned in to listen about how we give 3/4 of the world's dictators weapons, and but it ties all in, because we have a fundamental we have this mythology in this country, these beliefs that are just completely upended by reality about who we are, what we do. We just came off the November 11th, the Veterans Day, and all the thank you for your service and your sacrifice. I just saw that Ohio several years ago passed a bond to give every Afghanistan veteran a thank you bonus of $1,500. Now, the Ohio legislature, the reason why I read this is because the Ohio legislature didn't budget enough money for that. I don't know how they couldn't figure that out, but when they know how many veterans there are, right? But for what? Thank you for what? When was the last time there was an existential threat to this country? When was the last time there was a threat that was going to take away our Bill of Rights? I mean, the last time I can think about that, honestly, Nazi Germany never threatened the United States. Imperial Japan struck Hawaii and parts of Alaska, and sent some firebombs, some fire balloons into California, if I remember correctly. None of those were threats to our Bill of Rights and to our way of life. Last time you could come up with something is July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. That's the last time I think American veterans actually stood and protected the Constitution. So you have these mythologies that exist, these beliefs, these, all these, the platitudes, and that are completely undone by the reality. How can we be for freedom and liberty if we are giving weapons and money and we're training with these dictators, these monarchies, right? These military regimes, these autocracies. And, the thing about it is that you look at those, as you mentioned when you read the piece, you look at those who we don't give these things to, we sanction them.
Yes.
So it really is very clear, very simple. You're either with us or against us, to, remember the words of George W. Bush in 2002, when he makes his Axis of Evil speech and sets us on a path to kill over 1 million people in the Middle East and destroy the region, create mass instability, grow Al-Qaeda from an organization of 400 people worldwide to one with tens and tens of thousands of members, create the Islamic State, et cetera, replace the Taliban eventually with the Taliban in Afghanistan. This is the reality that completely undoes all our slogans, all our messages, all our parades, all our stand up and clap and thank veterans for their service, all the freedom. And you had that judge in the Rittenhouse case, his phone goes off and his cell phone is God, God bless the USA, which, is a song that if you listen to the lyrics, it doesn't exist in this world. Or maybe it does for a man like that judge, but not for, I think, you look at it, and this is what I say in that piece, is that we have to remember this next time Remember that we give weapons to three-quarters world dictators. The next time we're told that we have to fight China, the next time we're told that we have to fight Russia, right? I mean, we have, next time we're told that we have to bomb Iran
or Syria,
or we need to continue these sanctions against
Venezuela. My God, yeah,
right, that have killed tens of thousands of people. Our sanctions against Venezuela have killed tens of thousands of people. And just because you're against the sanctions doesn't mean you're for Maduro or you're a Chavist or anything like that. You can be, and that's where I get upset with people on the left, because I think you see these members of the left who are so quick to defend things maybe they shouldn't be defending, and they get wrapped up in the details of other countries when, look, man, you're an American. You should be concerned about what we're doing. And does China violate human rights? I have no doubt they violate human rights. You know who also violates human rights? The United States.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I'm an American, and that's my responsibility. If we were to have a clean house, if we didn't imprison, again, a quarter of the world's inmates weren't in our prisons, maybe I would say something about the Chinese. If we hadn't had what we did to our Muslim communities in the years after 2001, how the FBI infiltrated, how many Muslim men ended up in prison because they were entrapped. If we hadn't kidnapped over 700 innocent people and brought them to Guantanamo and tortured them, maybe I get a little upset about the Chinese and what they're doing to their Muslim population. But right now, my concern is, what are we doing as a people, and not allowing other people to deflect our attention from our own ills, our own sins, in order to launch a war against another nation, for reasons of profit, power, because it's good television, whatever, sells more aircraft carriers.
You're exactly right. And the other part about it that I always bring up to people, Iraq. My God, in that Afghanistan situation that you were involved in, I mean, there's no country on the earth in my lifetime that has done anything as egregious that's resulted in such a loss of life in both of those nations. It's just unbelievable what we did over there. And for us to try to dictate terms to any other country that's violating some human right, I mean, honest to God. And this is the point that I started off making at the beginning. Matthew Hoh was right about this Afghanistan thing. And we've talked about this before on the show, Matt, and I know that, you don't like to brag on that type of thing, obviously. But the point is, you were on those network television shows. I mentioned the fact that you were on all the major networks when you stepped aside there, resigned your post in the State Department. They ought to be bringing you back. Your phone ought to be ringing off the hook, because you have been vindicated and proven right in this, and it's not. And I appreciate your bringing up the Gerald Posner interview. He kind of intimated the same type of thing with pharma. He's got this book. All of his books are New York Times bestsellers. I mean, he's a brilliant writer. He gets invited to all of these television shows, particularly the daytime news shows, morning shows. His phone didn't ring. They weren't contacting him. Right. Why? Those television networks are underwritten by big pharma. That's what he thinks anyway. And he wasn't getting on those shows. And that dovetails very nicely into this next segment. And Matt kind of does, I don't know if he does this on purpose, but he kind of always leads me where we're going. I want to bring this up on not this here. Let me go back to where I want to bring this up on screen so that people can see this. Okay. So there's that. That was the tweet by Jim Earl that we had. Okay. So this is an article that appeared just this morning in USA Today, probably online yesterday, Matt. Afghan girls risk it all for an education. With Taliban in power, schools and books must be hidden. And the kind of the premise for my bringing this on, I wanted to talk a little bit and with somebody that you're well aware of, Noam Chomsky, and manufacturing consent, and how I think they're either dumb or they're in on it, or they're just not aware that they're doing it. This is about the plight in Afghanistan, and it ain't good. Let me tell you, Matt be the first to attest. It was a mess before we got there. It was a mess when we were there. It's a mess now. But when you read this, starting in Kabul, it starts with a personalization. Gerald Posner talked about that on the podcast. They always like to have a hero, any type of a screenwriter, any type of a Hollywood director, any type of a newspaper writer. So it talks about Mina Sadat. She rises each day at 6 a.m., puts on a long figure obscuring dark dress and hijab, steels herself for the angry eyes of Taliban officials. Oh, God. Angry eyes of Taliban officials. Go on, and I encourage everybody to read this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a long article. These highlights are mine. It says they have to hide their books and try to fully concentrate on their studies at the same time, which is not that easy. And, that is brutal and ugly. And then down to the next paragraph highlighted here. When the Taliban ruled from 1996 to 2001, they also barred women from wage-earning employment and education, similarly claiming it was a temporary security measure. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that for a minute here. I want to bring that back up. But, when I read these things, Matt, I'm always struck by how these nations, and they're called third world for a reason. Sometimes they're called primitive. Again, what your definition of primitive is. But they're not that far behind us. I mean, in some instances, not at all. But maybe just a few decades ago, a lot of what is being described in there with women could have applied to the United States. Again, this segues with what we were talking about earlier. Well, what if somebody from some other part of the world just decided to come over here and bomb the shit out of this country because of the way that we treat or have treated women in our own country? And that's used in this article to justify maybe what we've done. And if you are of that mind, you could use it as a means of justifying a redo even.
Yeah. Hey, what's the 1 in 4 women in America will be sexually assaulted or raped in their lifetime?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a war on women. That's not a crime against women.
Drop a bomb on us. I mean,
right,
blow us up.
I mean, it's, and in that lack of context, and this is part of manufacturing consent, that Chomsky and Edward Herman was the
they don't mention Herman very often.
Poor guy gets left out all the time, right? But one of the things you do is you leave out context. You drop the antecedents, right? History begins on a certain date. So history in Afghanistan begins on September 11th, 2001, or 1996 when the Taliban take Kabul. There's so much to it. And that piece does actually, if you read far enough, it does kind of make you aware that the Taliban aren't unique, that their views towards women are reflected in the male population. I think at some point in the article, it says that only 15% of Afghan men agree that women should work outside the home. The Taliban are reflective of Afghan society, particularly certain aspects of Afghan society. Are they more extreme and theatrical? Yes. But, the people that they replaced in Kabul, the Rabbani government and other warlords that had controlled Kabul before the Taliban took power in 96, they were equally as misogynist as the Taliban. They were the ones that brought the burqa to Kabul. The Taliban didn't bring the burqa to Kabul. By the time the Taliban take Kabul, the women of Kabul had been wearing the burqa for a few years at that point. It's context like that that's left out. A lot of discussion about Afghanistan right now. The crisis that's occurring there, right? They have no money. Their United Nations is saying as many as 1 million children may starve to death this winter. Well, that doesn't begin because the Taliban took power in August. Last year, Afghanistan, while the United States was still spending $300 million a day in Afghanistan, and our client government was in power, Afghanistan, according to the World Food Program, was the second most food insecure nation in the world. In 2020, a year before the Taliban take power, the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, says, 90% of my people live below the poverty line. These are things that have existed and have culminated because of the American occupation, because of the wars that preceded the occupation, because of the decisions in the 1970s to start a proxy war in Afghanistan. A great example is Zbigniew Brzezinski. I know I've talked about this with you before, but Brzezinski's idea that you could control
the belly,
where you can control these reactionary religious movements and create this revolution that, would not only cause the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, we get them in a trap, we would give them their own Vietnam, but that revolution would export itself up into the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union, and in Brzezinski's words, light the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union on fire. I mean, these were right. I mean, this is the mania, the idea that we can control people, groups, other religions, that they don't have their own agency, they don't have their own free will, or most especially, we can control violence. It is. And so you could see in that article the manufacturing consent. Yeah.
Let me bring that back up, because there's a couple of things here in these subsequent highlights here that really jumped out at me. And again, I've seen Chomsky interviewed about this manufacturing consent. These editors, these writers, these people on television, they're not even aware that they're doing it. Chomsky even admits that. He says the reason that you're doing this is because you've been chosen to do this. It's because you were picked to do this. I mean, a lot of people have been, it started in kindergarten, basically, to become these network television correspondents. But looking at these two highlighted areas here at the end, the number of Afghan girls enrolled in schools rose from 10 to 33% after the Taliban were forced from power. But a UN study in 2019 found that only 15% of Afghan men thought women should work outside the home after marriage, and 2/3 complained that women have too many rights. Well, there's men running all around this country complaining about women having too many rights. But the other part about it is, in 2019, I don't know if anybody should have been working outside of the home. That country is rubble, folks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been bombed everywhere. If you were a man that was in control of stuff, and maybe you wanted to protect your wife or daughter, you might not want her working outside of the home for that reason by itself. It wasn't safe. And then it leads me to this last paragraph here. Afghan girls are nothing if not resilient. When in May 2021, look at the way that this reads, and this is the insidious nature of manufacturing consent. When in May 2021, a bomb attack killed nearly 100 people close to Kabul's, I'm not going to pronounce that, Matt could, it's a school in Kabul. All of them members of the Hazara ethnic minority, and most of them girls just leaving class. Many of the school students quickly returned to the school. Okay, well, that bombing, I don't know who was responsible for that, but the bombing that took place in Afghanistan for 20 years, most of it, folks, fell from U.S. planes and mortars.
Yeah, and that bombing most likely was the work of the Islamic State in Khorasan, or Islamic State in Afghanistan, which is an interesting story. It's a very insidious story, the Islamic State in Afghanistan. And I urge people to go to an organization called the Afghan Analysts Network, who are terrific. They have been right on everything. I mean, for the last 20 years or even longer in Afghanistan. And, the story of the Islamic State in Afghanistan is a story that we've seen before in American foreign policy. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, along with the its Afghan counterpart, the National Director for Security at NDS, they brought in Pakistani fighters from the Pakistani Taliban, as well as disaffected or very radical or very reactionary Taliban, very, hardline Taliban. And someone's walking up to my door, so my dogs are going to go crazy in a second. Well, I apologize for this.
We're getting close to the end time here anyway. No problem.
I'm trying to. People who are watching me on YouTube right now are looking at me like pantomiming to. But anyway, what they did was the NDS and the CIA bring in these really extreme splinter groups into Afghanistan. They fund them. They coordinate with them. They help them. The idea is that they're going to use these extreme groups, this extreme Taliban, to splinter and fracture the existing Taliban. And this occurs around 2015 or so. And by 2016 or so, it hasn't worked. And so the NDS and CIA leave them.
Never works. Stupid.
Right? It doesn't work. And what do these people do? Yeah. Well, they look around and they say, well, hey, they're committed to their cause. They're going to keep fighting. So what they say is, we're going to start calling ourselves the Islamic State. and they adopt that title. That's a really terrific marketing, right, idea, because the Islamic State is gets you on the front page of newspapers, on television, whatever. But that is, just an example of one of many of what has occurred in Afghanistan is a making of the United States.
Yes.
And other people have been involved and not taking away agency of Afghans and other things. But yeah, I mean, like, this is a very real. And again, and this ties to what we were talking about earlier. When you support 3/4 of the world's dictators, right? When you build up your nuclear forces, when you do as Barack Obama did, reconfigure our nuclear missiles on our submarines to now become first strike weapons that completely invalidates any type of Chinese counter to our nuclear weapons. Well, the Chinese are going to build new nuclear weapons, right? I mean, and when you bring a rifle to a protest and you point it at somebody's going to throw a bag of socks at you, possibly, and then you're going to shoot them. And then somebody is going to see this, think you're an active shooter or whatever, and run over there and attack you. As 98% of the people are running away from you. You have these people who are going to do that. And I think most of the people who would be in line with Rittenhouse and, you did the right thing and guns and all that nonsense. Well, this is exactly what you're talking about. You had a man who attacked him with a skateboard to try and disarm him. I mean, this is what's going to happen when you introduce, weapons, when you threaten people, when you confront people. And my God, the fact that we have gone 75 years, more than 75 years now, with nuclear confrontation continually.
Yes.
And, we've had a lot of near misses. And I recommend people to read Dan Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine.
Now, people aren't aware of that. I've had that graphic up before. We're not just talking about an instance or two, folks. I mean, we're talking about dozens. I mean, lots of them,
when does our luck run out, George?
Yeah.
And with nuclear weapons, we need 100 nuclear weapons. That's it. 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. Most of our weapons are way bigger than that. Yeah. Right? I mean, you're talking about 0.1% of the world's nuclear weapons need to be exchanged in order to have a nuclear winter that will kill us off, because we'll all starve. Right. So India and Pakistan each have about 200 nuclear weapons. No, they each have about, hang on. They each have about 200 nuclear weapons. I mean, so all you need is India and Pakistan to shoot off 25% of their nuclear weapons, and we're all done for.
Yeah.
We're all done for. And how many times have India and Pakistan been to war since 1947? About 7, I think. 5, however many times, right? I mean, so yeah, the fact that we live like this, the fact that we have.
Do we trust them? I don't trust our own country, let alone trust them.
And we now have this. We now have a country, to get back to the, again, that where if you have a weapon, and as long as you feel that you are threatened, you seem to have a right to shoot anybody.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I didn't intend it this way, folks, but it's come full circle. I mean, that's exactly right. And that's a great wrap up. And that's a great way to put a bow on it. And ironically, we're coming up here. We just got a minute and a half to go, and we'll be at the top of the hour. And I think that's a good stopping point. Matt, give us another 30 seconds or a minute or so here to wrap up, and we'll say goodbye until next time.
I think we have to really address this issue of our mythology. We have to really address the core issues of who we are, in this violence, and violence can extend to a lack of compassion. I mean, you look at we're getting close to 800,000 dead from COVID now. And there's a lot to do with the vaccines and people not taking the vaccines, understand that, but there's a huge amount to do with the fact that we don't have a healthcare system that
200,000. Dude,
right? At least 200,000. That number comes from months ago.
Yes, and Fauci never says a word about it. Nobody does. My God, 200,000 preventable deaths of your brothers and sisters, children and grandparents, because we don't have a Medicare for all system that the rest of the industrialized world has had for decades, and we're spending $1 trillion a year blowing up countries like Afghanistan for worse than nothing. I mean, I just can't get over it.
Yeah, and so we have to, I really believe, take apart these, again, I keep using this word, but I can't seem to find a better one, mythologies, these mythological structures of who we are, and really address who we are. The fact that, I saw Joe Biden One of the things with the Build Back Better is going to reduce insulin prices down to $35 a month, which is a terrific move. But it's only if you have insurance.
Yeah.
If you don't have insurance, it doesn't help you. And it doesn't kick in until 2024 or something like that, which gives the next president or the next Congress or whoever plenty of time to undo it.
Helps
and
the
the fact
donors.
that we're even piecemealing it like that. What's one drug? What about all these other drugs that, but we beat our chests and we say we're the greatest nation on the earth and we have these freedoms and liberties.
Condemn others and
the biggest one for me, we're the most Christian nation, which, you know, is I think it's pretty, you know, the way we treat each other. I don't think Christ, as we're coming into the holiday season, right?
Horrified.
I can't imagine what he would have to say.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So.
Can't imagine. All right. Well, and speaking of the holidays, you enjoy yours. We'll circle back after the break here, Matt. And in the meantime, I want to encourage everybody to go to MatthewHoh.com. Check out his website and go to Counterpunch. See his articles there. Start looking, digging around, reaching out, seeing where the truth is, and following people, following truth tellers like Matthew Hoh. Matt, thanks once again for coming on another podcast by George Liveline.
Hey, thanks so much, George. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yeah, man. That's going to do it. And I hope you like these live lines from Podcast by George. And you can see them in their entirety, both in audio and video, always linked and available on podcastbygeorge.com. And then, of course, you can see the videos on Facebook and YouTube as well. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.